When I first drove up to the motel on the hill, the night was so dark that even the flickering streetlights seemed powerless. Fog curled along the asphalt, and a cold seeped into my skin, prickling like tiny needles. I parked the car, turned on the hazard lights, and my chest tightened with the feeling that someone or something was watching. Outside the windows, the old trees rustled their leaves, but the sound felt alive. I thought, maybe it's just an empty place, a motel long abandoned by guests. But when the phone in my room rang, though no one had called, I realized this was something else entirely. The parking lot was deserted, the fog swallowing everything beyond the dim glow of the lamps. The motel's facade looked like a relic of another time. Paint peeling, the sign cracked, and the glass doors barely hanging on their hinges. I grabbed my suitcase and stepped inside, the old wooden boards creaking under each footfall. Cold drafts slipped through the cracks, and every gust made the curtains and the windows sway as if they had a life of their own. The motel was silent, yet its silence weighed heavily. It felt like the walls themselves were observing. As we settle into this quiet night at the motel, leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even when you were completely alone? And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next moments of this story. I checked in and took the stairs up to my room. Every step echoed loudly through the empty corridor. The sense of solitude mixed with an uneasy anticipation of something unseen. My room looked typical for a 1970s motel. Furniture old but sturdy, the carpet worn, the air heavy with the scent of aged fabric and dust. I set my suitcase down and sat on the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I noticed a small detail. The shadows on the walls didn't quite match the shape of the furniture. They moved slightly differently, as if a faint current of air created extra motion, but there were no open windows or doors to let the wind in. I sat at the desk and opened my laptop, attempting to focus on my writing. But every sound in the room pulled my attention. Soft floorboards creaking, curtains brushing against the frame, and the phone ringing again. I picked it up, silence. Slowly, like someone tightening a noose around my nerves, I began recording my thoughts. It's just fatigue, I repeated to myself, yet my body insisted otherwise. A subtle, relentless anxiety pressed in from all sides. Now, as the rustle of the curtains and the creaks of the corridor feel almost tangible, think for a moment. Would you stay here alone? Comment below if you've ever felt something similar, and don't forget to subscribe to see what happens next. I decided to explore the corridor just to check the neighboring rooms, though I knew they were locked. The hallway stretched long and dimly lit, the shadows flickering with every step. Barely audible noises, footsteps that were not mine, made my heart leap. I looked back, empty, but when I turned forward, the sound repeated, now from the far end of the hall. My pulse quickened as my rational mind tried to explain it. Old floorboards, pipes, or I'm imagining things. I returned to my room and closed the door behind me, yet the feeling that I wasn't alone didn't dissipate. Even as I sat at the desk, attempting to write, every rustle and every whisper of air seemed deliberate, as if aimed directly at me. The phone rang again, this time with a faint echo that felt different from the first, like someone knew I had picked it up. I clenched my fists and drew a slow, deep breath, forcing myself to focus. But the motel, it seemed, wouldn't let me. The first block ends on the smallest, most unsettling moment. A faint footstep behind me, barely audible but unmistakable. I spun around. The hallway was empty. Only the shadows danced across the walls, and the cold draft reminded me that the motel was watching, listening, and waiting. After a restless night, I woke to the pale light of early morning filtering through the grimy curtains. The air in the room was still cold, but quieter than the night had been. I told myself I was imagining everything, that exhaustion and isolation had twisted my senses. But as I stepped toward the door, I heard it again, a soft creak, almost like the groan of old wood coming from the corridor outside. My stomach tightened. I knew the hallway was empty, yet my body reacted as though someone were just out of sight, observing. The corridor stretched long and narrow, illuminated by the flickering ceiling lights that cast jagged shadows on the worn carpet. I moved slowly, each step deliberately measured, trying not to make a sound. The air smelled faintly of dust and something metallic like rusted nails, and it clung to my lungs. My eyes darted from one door to another. Some were shut tightly, others ajar just a crack. I could swear that, for a moment, one shadow moved independently, sliding along the wall against the direction of the light. I paused outside a room at the far end of the hall. The door was closed, but I thought I heard a low whisper, so faint I could not distinguish words. My pulse raced, and I leaned my ear toward the wood. Nothing. Yet the feeling of presence lingered, heavy and pressing. I tried to rationalize it. Old building, settling, win my imagination. But my gut told me otherwise. I stepped into a side hallway, narrower, darker, the flickering bulbs casting long, uneven shadows across the walls. The air was colder here, and I shivered as a draft brushed against my neck. I pressed my back to the wall, listening. There was again a soft step behind me, then silence. I spun around. Nothing. I tried to focus on my breathing, counting slowly, trying to convince myself that the motel's atmosphere was just playing tricks. But then I noticed it. The furniture in one of the rooms seemed slightly shifted. A chair was turned, a small table nudged forward. I had no memory of moving anything, and the locks on the doors were intact. My rational mind began to fracture under the weight of these small, unexplainable details. Shadows flickered in ways that didn't match the light, and at times I thought I could see shapes moving just beyond the edge of my vision. Shapes that didn't belong to anyone, yet felt deliberate. I sat down on the worn bench in the hallway, trying to collect myself. I pulled out my notebook and began writing notes. Not a story, but observations. Shadows, movement, whispers, furniture, shifted, footsteps, cold air. Each line was like a tether to reality, a way to anchor myself. Yet as I wrote, I could not shake the sensation that the motel itself was aware of my presence, studying my every move, waiting for something. At that moment, I remember the mirror in my room. I had barely glanced at it the night before, but now it drew me in like a magnet. Across the hall, a cracked vanity mirror reflected the dim corridor lights, and for a heartbeat, I saw my own reflection. But then I noticed something strange. The shadow behind me in the mirror didn't match my own movements. I froze. My reflection shifted slightly to the left while I remained still. A chill crept up my spine, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I stumbled back, heart hammering, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. But as I turned toward my room to retreat, I caught movement in the corner of my eye, a fleeting silhouette darting behind another doorway. I froze again. The motel was silent, yet I could hear the faint echo of my own breathing amplified in the empty hallway. Each step I took toward my door felt heavier, as if the building itself resisted my movement. It was here, in this tense liminality, that I realized something about the motel. It was patient, slow, observing, not overtly malicious, but persistent, like a predator studying its prey. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every shifting shadow seemed designed to test my nerves, to draw me out of the realm of rationality and into something else entirely. I reached my room at last, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, chest rising and falling rapidly, listening. The hallway outside seemed quiet now, almost too quiet. I forced myself to sit at the desk again, opening my laptop to write. But my eyes kept darting to the shadows, my ears straining for sounds that might, or might not, be real. The phone rang again. I jumped, my fingers trembling. I picked up silence. And then, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, a repetition of my own voice. "You shouldn't be here." My hand shook as I set the receiver down. Rationally, I knew the line was silent. Yet the sound lingered in my head, pressing against my thoughts, nudging my fear into something more primal. I tried to distract myself by making notes on everything I had observed so far. Every detail, every sound, every flicker of light became crucial, a map of anomalies. And yet, despite my best efforts, I felt an undeniable shift in the air around me. The motel was no longer just a building, it was a presence. Patient, observant, a quiet intelligence weaving itself around my perception. I thought I could hear movement again in the hallway, soft shuffles that didn't belong to anyone I could see. I held my breath, heart racing. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally in the corners of my vision. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Old wood, wind, fatigue, but none satisfied the gut-deep terror that had settled over me. Then, as I attempted to steady myself, I realized something else. I was no longer just observing the motel. It was observing me, waiting, learning, and somewhere in the quiet, the echo of the whispered words lingered, insistent. "You shouldn't be here." Night fell fully, and with it came a silence that felt heavier than the day. The flickering ceiling lights had long since dimmed, leaving the hallway in near darkness, pierced only by the weak glow from a single bulb at the far end. The air was colder now, carrying the faint metallic tang of old iron and dust. Every sound was magnified. The distant drip of water somewhere unseen, the soft moan of old wood settling, the faint brush of air across the carpet. I felt as though the walls themselves were listening, and that every creak, every sigh, every tiny disturbance was purposeful. I paced the hallway, notebook in hand, recording the minutiae, the shadows stretching unnaturally, the occasional movement in the periphery, the faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to follow me from door to door. Each step I took seemed to echo longer than it should have, bouncing off the walls in uneven patterns. Occasionally, I thought I saw shapes gliding past the cracked windows of the doors, too quick to be fully seen, too deliberate to be accidental. My rational mind sought explanations, drafts, fatigue, imagination. But as the night deepened, the veil of reason grew thinner. The phone rang again, breaking the silence, and I froze mid-step. This time, I did not reach for it. I knew the line would be silent, and yet, as I lingered in the dim corridor, I thought I could hear something else. Whispers, almost imperceptible, repeating fragments of thoughts I had only just considered. Names, faint laughter, the scraping of footsteps, but none of them entirely human. My pulse raced, and I pressed my back to the wall, trying to steady my breath. The shadows were no longer subtle. They twisted the edges of the hall, stretching longer than they should, pooling unnaturally in corners, creeping toward me when I wasn't looking directly at them. At one point, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, motionless, just outside the weak circle of light. My heart skipped. I raised my flashlight, the beam trembling in my hand. When I swept across the hallway, there was nothing, no figure, no object, only the warped patterns of shadow and light. Yet I could still feel a presence, watching, waiting. I returned to my room, slamming the door, and tried to lock it, but the sound felt hollow, insignificant. The darkness outside the door seemed to press against it, almost tactile, as though testing the barrier between me and whatever lingered in the hall. I collapsed onto the bed, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of it. Exhaustion weighed on me, but my mind refused rest. Every creak, every shuffle, every whisper pulled me further from reality, deeper into the motel's grasp. I glanced at the mirror in my room and froze. My reflection was not entirely my own. For a heartbeat, the shadow behind me moved independently, leaning slightly, tilting its head, observing. I could not move. I could not look away. And then it was gone. The mirror reflected only me again, pale and trembling, clutching at the edge of the desk. But the impression remained. Something had been there. Something had studied me. Something had learned how I moved, how I breathed, how I reacted. I forced myself to write, to anchor my thoughts in observation rather than fear. I chronicled every sound, every shadow, every movement, every fleeting anomaly that my mind could not yet explain. The motel seemed to respond. Footsteps echoed louder. Curtains rustled more violently. The air grew chillier with every passing minute. The building was no longer just a backdrop. It was an active participant. It whispered, it waited, it tested the edges of my perception. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I could no longer tell. The night had collapsed into a continuous stretch of subtle terror. The phone rang once more. This time, I did not reach for it. I only heard the soft, deliberate steps outside my door, circling, pausing, retreating, and returning again. A faint, mocking echo of my own breathing accompanied it. I dared not look through the peephole. I dared not open the door. The sound was enough. Then a whisper, my name, soft, slow, deliberate, not from the hallway, not from the phone, from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside the walls, or perhaps inside my own mind. Dennis, it lingered, pressing against my thoughts, burrowing under my skin. My rational mind screamed for explanations, but the primal part of me, the part that recognized danger, understood one truth. Whatever had my attention now was patient, intelligent, and persistent. I lay back on the bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch toward me. Every draft was more than air, every small noise a potential warning. The motel was alive in a way I had not anticipated. Not screaming or overtly violent, but methodical, deliberate, aware. And somewhere, just out of reach, it waited for me to slip, to falter, to acknowledge its presence fully. By the time the first hint of dawn tried to creep through the grimy curtains, I realized something terrifying. The motel did not care if I left. It had already claimed my attention, my senses, my perception, and the shadows that danced just beyond vision would continue to follow, to whisper, to observe, long after the day reclaimed the world outside. By the time night fell again, I felt as though the motel had merged with my own mind. Every shadow in the hallway seemed sentient, every flicker of the dim lights deliberate. The air was colder than before, carrying a damp, metallic tang that clung to my skin. I could no longer tell if the whispers I heard were in the building, in the walls, or in my own thoughts. The line between reality and imagination had begun to blur. I tried to convince myself to stay in my room, to avoid the hallways, but an inexplicable pull drew me out. The corridor stretched endlessly in the weak light, the carpeted floor muffling my footsteps, yet amplifying every creak from the structure itself. The walls seemed to breathe with me, or perhaps against me. I could sense, rather than see, that something moved just beyond my field of vision, lingering in corners, shifting when I wasn't looking. Each room I passed offered subtle signs of presence. A chair slightly turned, a door ajar that I was certain had been closed, faint scratches along the woodwork. My pulse quickened, but I pressed on, compelled by curiosity and fear. The motel had become a living organism, and I was trapped within it, a fragile consciousness under observation. I paused outside a mirror in the hallway, its cracked surface reflecting the faint corridor light. For a brief moment, I thought I saw more than my own reflection. The figure behind me, dark, indistinct, tilted its head, watching. I spun around. Nothing. The hall was empty. Yet when I turned back, the reflection lingered, shadows stretching unnaturally, mocking my disbelief. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breath. My notebook lay open on the floor of my room, filled with frantic observations. Yet it could not contain the entirety of what I was experiencing. The sounds had grown sharper, soft scraping along the walls, the faint shuffle of steps that did not belong to me. Each whisper, each creak, each subtle movement felt calculated, intentional. It was as though the motel was learning me, anticipating my reactions, testing my boundaries. The phone rang again. I froze. Its tone was slower this time, deliberate. I didn't answer, but the whisper followed, a low, elongated repetition of my own name. Denis, Dennis. It seemed to seep from the walls themselves. My rational mind protested, but the deeper, instinctive part of me knew. This was not merely the building settling. This was a presence, patient and intelligent, shaping itself around my perception, exploiting my fear. I returned to my room, shutting the door, but the sensation of being observed intensified. The shadows in the corners of the ceiling stretched further, deeper, as if drawn toward me. The air pressed against my skin like a living thing. I sank into the bed, but the comfort it should have offered was absent. Even the blankets felt wrong, cold, heavy, and almost sentient, clinging in a way that mirrored the motel's calculated attention. I tried to work, writing notes, attempting to anchor myself with logic. The shadows move independently, footsteps echo strangely, whispers repeat thoughts I've had, objects shift when I'm not looking. But the act of documenting only heightened my awareness. The building responded. Scraping sounds along the floorboards grew louder, more rhythmic, each creak a metronome measuring my panic. The mirrors reflected a distorted corridor, elongated and impossible, and in those reflections, shadows danced with intentions of their own. Hours passed, or perhaps they were minutes. I could no longer gauge time. My body shook from a mixture of cold, exhaustion, and fear. Every attempt to dismiss the phenomena as hallucinations failed. The motel had begun to integrate itself into my senses. The whisper of my name now echoed from multiple directions, sometimes overlapping, creating an impossible layering of sound. The shadows were not content to linger at the periphery. They pressed closer, elongating across the floor and walls, almost tangible in their movement. Then came the first deliberate act. My desk lamp flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for a brief heartbeat. When it reignited, I swore the chair at my desk had turned toward the doorway. I hadn't moved it. My fingers clutched the edge of the table, heart hammering, breath shallow. The motel was no longer subtle. It was asserting itself, and yet it remained frustratingly elusive, never fully visible, never directly confrontational. I tried to calm myself, reasoning that I had entered a mental spiral, but the shadows responded. One corner of the room darkened more than the rest, dense, impenetrable. I could feel a weight there, a presence pressing silently against my perception. My mind screamed to flee, to leave, but the hallways beyond the door seemed different now. Longer, distorted, impossible. The exit was no longer straightforward. The building had begun to manipulate the space itself, bending perception, altering reality in subtle, insidious ways. I sank to the floor, back against the wall, knees drawn close. Every sound, every whisper, every flicker of shadow gnawed at my nerves. The motel was patient, intelligent, and utterly silent in its intent. It tested me, learning my responses, teaching me that perception was no longer trustworthy. And then, just before I felt the edge of complete panic, I heard it, a faint, soft scraping along the wall, deliberate, rhythmic, accompanied by a whisper almost too quiet to hear. "You cannot leave." I froze. Every instinct screamed to flee, but my body refused to move. The motel had begun to define my limits, showing me the fragile boundary between fear and reality. I realized, with a sinking certainty, that my presence here had changed the building as much as it had changed me. I was no longer merely an observer. I was a participant. The night stretched endlessly, and in that suffocating darkness, I understood something I could not yet admit fully. The motel was patient. It waited, and it would not stop. By now, the night had fully claimed the motel, and I felt every inch of it pressing in on me. The shadows were no longer subtle, no longer flickering at the edge of perception. They moved with intent, sliding along walls, pooling in corners, stretching across the floor toward me. Each step I took in the hallway echoed unnaturally, bouncing back at impossible angles, a distorted rhythm I could not match. The air was thick and damp, carrying a metallic, almost coppery scent that clung to my clothes and skin. The building itself seemed alive, watching, adapting. I realized I had to leave. Every instinct screamed to escape, to reach the outside world, to reclaim the familiar and rational. I grabbed my suitcase and ran down the hallway, only to find the layout subtly changed. Doors were in different places, corridors longer, shadows thicker. Panic surged. My footsteps pounded against the warped carpet, but the exit seemed to recede as I approached it, as if the motel itself was bending reality to trap me. The whispers grew louder, layered now, overlapping my thoughts with their own rhythm. "You cannot leave, stay, you belong." I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block the sound, but it penetrated deeper, burrowing into my mind. The shadows began to move independently, coalescing in forms just beyond recognition, just beyond understanding. They shifted closer, following, advancing with intent. I reached a staircase, hoping to descend and find the parking lot. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step amplified into a metallic screech that echoed through the building. I glanced upward and froze. At the top of the staircase, in the dim glow of the remaining flickering light, a figure lingered, dark, indistinct, but impossibly still. My rational mind screamed that it was a trick of the light, but instinct told me otherwise. It waited, patient, watching. I stumbled down the steps, heart hammering, desperate to escape. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, doors on both sides warped, shadows shifting. A cold draft brushed against my neck, moving with purpose. I could hear the faint scraping of nails along walls, deliberate, measured, testing my resolve. The whispers multiplied, echoing, overlapping. "You cannot leave, you cannot leave." I reached for a door that I hoped would lead outside, but it was locked, and then another, also locked. The building mocked me with every attempt to exit, twisting the space, bending perception. The shadows converged, pooling at the edges of my vision, dense and almost tangible. The air grew heavier, colder, pressing against my chest with each desperate inhale. Then a sound, a low, deliberate tapping, echoing along the walls. It began slow, measured, then quickened in tempo, matching the rhythm of my heart. I spun around. Shapes moved in the corners, dark, shifting, intelligent. The whispers were no longer faint. They were insistent, calling my name, repeating thoughts I had never spoken aloud. "You belong here, you belong here." I ran. The corridors twisted further, impossible angles forming before me. I could hear my own breathing amplified by the silence around me. Yet the whispers persisted, surrounding me, filling my mind. Mirrors along the hallway reflected impossible versions of the space. Elongated corridors, multiple shadows, forms that moved independently of me. One mirror reflected my own face, and behind me, a darker version, tilting its head, observing. Desperation overtook me. I smashed a door open, hoping for a stairwell, a fire exit, anything. The room inside was empty, but the air was thick, oppressive. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching toward me, almost crawling along the floor. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping. You cannot leave, stay forever. My chest tightened, the sense of suffocation nearly overwhelming me. I forced myself to move, dragging my suitcase, running blindly, trusting only instinct. The building resisted, corridors twisting, doors moving, shadows sliding just out of reach. My mind teetered on the edge of sanity, every rational thought swallowed by the relentless pressure of the motel's presence. The whispers, the shifting shadows, the impossible architecture, it was all one entity now, focused entirely on me. And then I saw it, the exit, light spilling through a crack at the far end of the hallway, the faint outline of the parking lot beyond. Relief surged, but it was short-lived. As I ran toward it, the shadows thickened at my sides, coalescing into a wall of darkness. The whispers intensified into a chorus, chanting, "You cannot leave, you cannot leave, you belong." My heart raced, lungs burning. The exit receded, the shadows closing in, yet something within me surged, a desperate, primal will to escape. I reached the threshold. The air beyond the door was crisp, real, tangible. I stumbled outside, breath heaving, heart pounding. The parking lot lay empty, fog curling lazily around the weak streetlights. I looked back at the building, silent, still, empty, or so it seemed. I ran to my car, hands shaking, fumbling with the keys. The night was quiet now, the oppressive presence lifting as I moved farther away. But deep inside, I knew the motel had not released me entirely. Its patience, its intelligence, its subtle, persistent influence, they would linger. Somewhere just beyond perception, it would wait. And I would never truly be free of it. Morning arrived slowly, pale and tentative, as if the world itself were unsure it had the right to reclaim the night. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, heart still hammering, lungs burning from the desperate escape. The motel on the hill loomed behind me, silent, immovable, deceptively ordinary in the weak light of dawn. The fog clung to the ground like a shroud, curling lazily around the empty parking lot. And yet, despite the apparent calm, I could feel it. That subtle, intelligent presence, the motel watching, patient waiting. I tried to rationalize the night, to convince myself it had all been a hallucination brought on by isolation, fatigue, and stress. But the evidence lingered in subtle, undeniable ways. My notebook filled with frantic observations, the scratches along the walls, the shifted furniture, the mirrors reflecting shadows that should not exist. Every sense had been attuned to something impossible, something aware. I had escaped, yes, but the motel had left its mark. As I drove down the winding road, the weight of what I had experienced pressed on me. Shadows seemed to linger in my peripheral vision, fleeting but insistent. The whispers, though faint, echoed in my mind. "You belong. You cannot leave." I clenched my hands on the wheel, forcing myself to focus on the road ahead, on the ordinary world beyond the hill. Yet I knew, deep down, that the motel's influence had seeped into me. It had learned me, mapped my fears, and in doing so, left something behind. By noon, the sun had risen fully, bathing the landscape in a false reassurance. I parked at a gas station, trying to calm myself with the mundane tasks of filling the tank, checking the oil, drinking a coffee. Yet even there, ordinary life seemed tinged with the memory of that place. The air felt heavier, as if carrying a residue of the motel's presence. Every reflection in a store window, every dark corner in the parking lot, seemed to hint at the impossible. My mind could not fully grasp it, could not fully release it. That evening, back in a rented motel in a nearby town, I reviewed the photos I had taken. The empty corridors, the warped hallways, the distorted reflections in the mirrors. Most were innocuous at first glance, but in each frame, subtle anomalies appeared. shadows bending impossibly, a door slightly ajar that should have been closed, patterns in the light that seemed deliberate. The motel had left a fingerprint, a reminder that reality itself had been manipulated. Sleep came fitfully, fragmented by dreams of corridors stretching endlessly, shadows moving independently, and the same faint whispers repeating my name. I awoke each time to an uncanny stillness, the world around me seemingly unchanged, yet my perception forever altered. The motel had shown me its patience, its intelligence, its quiet control. And in doing so, it had changed something fundamental inside me, a lingering fear, a knowledge that somewhere, just out of sight, it waited. Weeks passed. Life resumed its routines, but the memory remained vivid. When I close my eyes, I see those hallways, that flickering light, the shadows that moved with intention. When I hear a creak in the floor or a whisper carried on the wind, a shiver runs down my spine, and I am transported back to that night, to that patient, observing presence. I am free, in one sense, yet forever tethered to the motel on the hill. I have returned to the place once, months later, from a distance, watching from the road as the fog curled around the building. It looked ordinary, abandoned, quiet, but I knew better. I could sense it waiting, patient as ever, aware of the possibility of my return. The shadows, the whispers, the deliberate anomalies, all dormant, yet alive. And I knew, without question, they would always be there, shaping reality subtly, persistently, invisibly. In the end, I learned that the motel did not need to chase me. It simply needed to exist. Its presence, subtle and intelligent, had extended beyond its walls, lingering in my mind, in my perception, in the quiet spaces of my life. I cannot see it, I cannot touch it, but I could feel it, always like the faint pressure of shadow, just beyond vision. And in that realization lay the deepest terror. The motel waits. Patient, knowing, silent, eternal. And now, when I pass an old building, a hallway, a dimly lit room, I pause. My heart quickens. I wonder what shadows move just beyond my sight, what presences linger in the folds of ordinary reality, waiting for someone to notice. The experience has left me changed, aware of how fragile perception is, how easily the mind can be manipulated by subtle intelligence. I carry the motel with me, not physically, but in the echo of every unexplained noise, every shifting shadow, every faint whisper. Some nights, when the wind howls just right, I hear it again. Not directly, not clearly, but unmistakably. A patient, deliberate murmur in the back of my mind. You belong. You cannot leave. And I know, as long as I live, the motel on the hill will wait.